There exists among us a particular type of individual who moves through the world with a peculiar awareness, a depth that seems incongruent with their years on this planet. These are the ones Alan Watts might have described as those who have begun to wake up from what he called the skin-encapsulated ego, the illusion that we are separate beings, isolated islands of consciousness in a vast and indifferent universe. The old soul recognizes, often without being able to articulate it, that this separation is fundamentally false. They sense the interconnectedness of all things, the way a wave might suddenly realize it is not separate from the ocean. This awareness, however, comes with a price that many do not anticipate. It creates a permeable boundary between self and other, a boundary that becomes both their greatest gift and their most challenging burden. Consider for a moment what Watts taught us about the nature of reality. He spoke eloquently about how we have been conditioned to experience ourselves as strangers in this world, as egos trapped inside bags of skin, looking out at an alien universe. The old soul has begun to see through this construction. They experience what Watts called the real you, not the ego with its endless demands and anxieties, but the fundamental consciousness that observes, that is aware, that simply exists without the constant need to prove itself or defend its territory. This expanded sense of self, this dissolution of rigid boundaries, manifests in everyday life in ways both beautiful and exhausting. The old soul walks into a room and immediately senses the emotional undercurrents. They feel the unspoken tensions, the hidden sorrows, the desperate needs of those around them. This is not supernatural perception. It is simply what happens when someone stops being so completely absorbed in their own internal narrative that they can actually pay attention to the reality that surrounds them. But here is where the mechanism of attraction begins, subtle and inevitable as gravity. The broken people, those who Watts might describe as still firmly trapped in the ego's illusion, are drawn to the old soul like moths to flame. And why wouldn't they be? The old soul radiates something that the broken desperately seek, a sense of wholeness, of peace, of centeredness that seems to promise relief from their internal chaos. Watts often spoke about how we are all fundamentally seeking the same thing, to return to that original state of unity, that sense of being at home in the universe. The broken person has lost this sense entirely, if they ever had it. They experience themselves as fragmented, at war with themselves, perpetually inadequate. When they encounter an old soul, they unconsciously recognize someone who has accessed something they desperately want. But they misunderstand what it is and how to obtain it. The broken person believes, often unconsciously, that the old soul possesses something that can be taken, absorbed, or transferred. They do not yet understand Watts's fundamental teaching, that what they seek cannot be given by another because it is already what they are. The peace, the wholeness, the sense of being enough, these are not commodities to be acquired from someone else. They are the natural state that emerges when we stop fighting against reality, when we cease the exhausting project of trying to be something other than what we are. This misunderstanding creates a dynamic that becomes increasingly draining for the old soul. The broken person attaches themselves, seeking to extract what they believe the old soul possesses. They come with their endless crises, their dramatic narratives, their desperate need for validation and rescue. And the old soul, with their permeable boundaries and their genuine compassion, initially responds with generosity. Here is where we must understand something crucial that Watts emphasized repeatedly. Compassion without wisdom becomes codependency. The old soul feels the suffering of others so acutely that they leap to alleviate it. But in doing so, they often prevent the broken person from undergoing the very suffering that might lead to their awakening. What's understood that growth requires resistance, that transformation demands we face what we would prefer to avoid. The old soul becomes trapped in what appears to be helping, but is actually a form of enabling. They give their time, their energy, their emotional resources, their very life force to someone who is not ready or willing to do the internal work necessary for genuine transformation. And because the broken person's fundamental problem is internal, a misidentification with the ego, a rejection of their true nature, no amount of external support can solve it. Meanwhile, the old soul begins to experience a peculiar exhaustion. It is not merely physical tiredness, though that certainly manifests. It is a deeper depletion, a sense that their very essence is being drawn away. They notice they feel empty after interactions with certain people, that they need longer and longer periods of solitude to recover, that they are increasingly resentful even as they continue to give. Watts would point out that this exhaustion is itself a teaching, a signal that something is fundamentally out of alignment. The old soul is attempting to maintain an illusion that they are responsible for others' happiness, that they can do someone else's spiritual work for them, that love means sacrificing oneself to the point of self-destruction. These beliefs, though they may wear the mask of compassion, are actually ego constructions, as surely as the broken person's neediness is. The tragedy is that both parties are suffering unnecessarily. The broken person is not actually getting what they need, which is to confront their own nature and discover their own wholeness. The old soul is not actually helping. They are participating in a drama that prevents growth for both individuals. It is a dance of mutual delusion, however well-intentioned. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is that it masquerades as virtue. The old soul tells themselves they are being compassionate, loving, selfless. Society reinforces this narrative, praising those who sacrifice endlessly for others. But Watts understood that this type of self-sacrifice is often not wisdom, but confusion, not love, but fear. Fear of being selfish, fear of disappointing others, fear of facing one's own needs and limitations. The old soul must come to understand something paradoxical. True compassion sometimes looks like refusal. True love sometimes requires letting someone face the consequences of their choices. True wisdom recognizes that we cannot save anyone from the work of awakening to their own nature. We can point the way, certainly. We can offer tools and insights, but we cannot do the walking for another person. As this first chapter closes, we arrive at a crucial question. How does the old soul distinguish between genuine giving and harmful enabling? How do they maintain their natural compassion while establishing boundaries that protect their vital energy? To answer these questions, we must go deeper into the nature of energy itself and the mechanics of how this draining occurs. Alan Watts had a remarkable way of demystifying complex spiritual concepts by grounding them in observable reality. When we speak of energy drain, we are not referring to some mystical force, but to very real psychological and physiological processes. The old soul's exhaustion is not imaginary. It manifests in concrete ways that affect their health, their clarity of mind, and their capacity to engage with life fully. Consider what happens in the body and mind during these draining interactions. The old soul encounters the broken person, who arrives in a state of high emotional activation, anxiety, depression, anger, desperation. These are not merely abstract feelings, but embodied states involving stress hormones, nervous system dysregulation, and chaotic thought patterns. The broken person broadcasts this chaos outward, seeking regulation from external sources because they have not developed the capacity to regulate themselves. The old soul, with their highly developed empathy and their dissolved boundaries, automatically begins to resonate with this chaotic state. Mirror neurons fire, creating an internal echo of the other person's emotional experience. The old soul's nervous system shifts to match the frequency of distress it encounters. This is not conscious or voluntary. It is an automatic response born from their expanded awareness and their deep capacity for connection. Watts would remind us that this capacity for resonance is not inherently problematic. In fact, it is the very mechanism through which we experience genuine human connection. The issue arises when this resonance becomes one-directional, when the old soul continuously adapts to the broken person's frequency, without the broken person making any effort to regulate themselves or even acknowledging the effect they are having. The broken person has learned, often unconsciously, that they feel better after spending time with the old soul. They leave the interaction feeling calmer, more centered, more hopeful. But this improvement is temporary, because it is borrowed rather than generated from within. They have not learned to access their own capacity for peace. They have simply extracted it from someone else, and so they return again and again, like addicts seeking their next fix. The old soul, meanwhile, finds themselves depleted. They may experience physical symptoms, profound fatigue, headaches, digestive issues, immune system suppression. Their sleep becomes disrupted, their appetite changes. These are not coincidental. They are the body's response to chronic stress and the depletion of regulatory resources. The old soul has been functioning as an external nervous system for someone else, and this is exhausting work that was never meant to be sustained long-term. But the exhaustion goes deeper than the physical. There is a spiritual dimension to this drain that Watts understood intimately. The old soul begins to lose touch with their own center, their own authentic presence. They become so focused on managing others' emotions and needs that they forget to simply be. They lose access to what Watts called the eternal now, that state of present awareness in which we are not constantly trying to fix or change anything, but simply existing in open attention to what is. This loss of center is perhaps the most serious consequence. The old soul's great gift was their ability to rest in being rather than constantly doing, to experience life directly rather than through the filter of ego's anxious planning and judgment. But when they become entangled with the broken person's drama, they lose this capacity. They become reactive, strategic, manipulative in subtle ways, trying to manage the other person's emotions, trying to prevent crises, trying to say the right thing to avoid meltdowns. Watts taught that wisdom requires discrimination, the ability to see clearly what is our responsibility and what is not. The old soul must learn to distinguish between compassionate response and compulsive rescuing. Compassionate response recognizes suffering and offers appropriate support while respecting the other person's agency and responsibility for their own life. Compulsive rescuing tries to prevent another person from experiencing the natural consequences of their choices and patterns. The question becomes, how does the old soul break this pattern? The answer requires understanding something fundamental about the nature of relationship and energy exchange. Healthy relationships are characterized by reciprocity, not necessarily equal exchange in every moment, but a fundamental balance over time. Each person brings something, each person gives and receives. Each person takes responsibility for their own emotional state while remaining open to genuine connection. The relationship between the old soul and the broken person lacks this reciprocity. It has become what Watts might call a stuck pattern, a habitual way of relating that no longer serves growth, but instead perpetuates suffering for both parties. To shift this pattern requires the old soul to do something that feels counterintuitive and even cruel at first. They must stop rescuing. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means recognizing that true compassion sometimes manifests as allowing someone to experience the full weight of their choices. It means trusting that the broken person has within them the same fundamental nature that the old soul has accessed, the capacity for awareness, for presence, for self-regulation. By constantly intervening, the old soul prevents the broken person from discovering this capacity. Watts often spoke about how we learn through direct experience rather than through being told. The broken person cannot be talked into wholeness or rescued into peace. They must undergo their own journey of awakening, their own confrontation with the patterns that create their suffering. The old soul's constant intervention actually interferes with this process, however well-intentioned it may be. Setting boundaries becomes not an act of selfishness, but an act of profound respect for both oneself and the other person. When the old soul says, "I cannot be available for these late-night crisis calls anymore," or "I need you to work with a therapist rather than relying solely on me for emotional support," they are actually honoring both their own needs and the other person's potential for growth. The broken person will likely respond with distress to these boundaries. They may accuse the old soul of abandonment, of not caring, of being selfish. This reaction confirms the dynamic that has been operating. The broken person has become dependent on external regulation rather than developing internal resources. The old soul must hold steady in the face of this distress, recognizing it as a withdrawal symptom rather than evidence that boundaries are wrong. This requires tremendous courage and clarity. The old soul must face their own conditioning that equates love with self-sacrifice, that measures worth by how much one gives up for others. They must confront the ego's investment in being needed, in being the rescuer, in being special because of their capacity to help. These are subtle forms of ego gratification that masquerade as spiritual virtue. Watts would point to the paradox at the heart of this situation. By trying to help in ways that actually harm, the old soul is still operating from ego. True selflessness recognizes that we are all expressions of the same fundamental reality, and what serves genuine wholeness for one ultimately serves all. When the old soul restores their own center, when they protect their own energy and vitality, they actually become more capable of genuine service, not codependent enmeshment, but clear, boundaried presence. The path forward requires the old soul to engage in practices that restore their connection to their own center. This might include meditation, time in nature, creative expression, physical movement, whatever helps them return to the direct experience of being, rather than the constant doing of problem-solving and rescuing. They must relearn how to simply be present with what is, without the compulsion to fix or change it. They must also examine their own patterns with ruthless honesty. What do they gain from being the rescuer? What are they avoiding in their own life by focusing on others' problems? What would it feel like to be ordinary rather than special, to acknowledge their limitations rather than maintain the illusion of endless capacity to give? These are uncomfortable questions, but they point toward genuine liberation. The old soul's journey is not about becoming less compassionate, but about developing what Watts called wisdom compassion. Compassion informed by clear seeing, compassion that recognizes the fundamental autonomy and responsibility of each being. This type of compassion does not leap to rescue, but instead holds space for another's process while maintaining clear boundaries about what is, and is not, one's responsibility. As they develop this wisdom, the old soul discovers something remarkable. They have more energy, not less. When they stop trying to carry others' burdens, their own vital force returns. They become more present, more creative, more joyful. And paradoxically, they become more genuinely helpful because they are no longer operating from depletion and resentment, but from authentic fullness and clarity. The broken person, confronted with these new boundaries, faces a choice. They can continue to seek external rescue, moving from one old soul to another in a perpetual quest for someone to solve their problems. Or they can begin the difficult work of turning inward, of discovering their own capacity for wholeness. The old soul cannot make this choice for them. They can only hold the space and trust the process. As we close this exploration, let us return to Alan Watts's fundamental insight. You are not a stranger in this universe. You are not a separate fragment trying desperately to find completion through others. You are an expression of the whole, temporarily forgetting its nature, playing at being lost so that it might experience the joy of being found. For the old soul who has been drained by the broken, the invitation is not to harden your heart, but to clarify your seeing. Recognize that your capacity for deep feeling and genuine connection is a gift, but it must be balanced with discernment. Not everyone who is hungry deserves your bread, especially if feeding them prevents them from learning to bake. For those who identify as the broken person, the invitation is equally profound. Stop seeking completion outside yourself. The old souls you are drawn to do not possess something you lack. They have simply remembered something you have forgotten. That same remembering is available to you, but it requires you to stop running from your own experience, to stop demanding that others regulate your emotional states, to stop treating your awakening as someone else's responsibility. The dance between old souls and broken people is not wrong or bad. It is part of how consciousness explores itself, how we learn about boundaries and compassion, responsibility and connection. But it need not continue indefinitely. Both parties can wake up from the dream of codependency into the reality of authentic relationship. True relationship honors the sovereignty of each being. It recognizes that we are simultaneously absolutely interconnected and absolutely individual. We affect each other, yes, but we do not complete each other. We are already complete, already whole, already exactly what we need to be in this moment. The work is not to find someone to fill our emptiness, but to recognize that the emptiness itself is an illusion created by the ego's mistaken belief that it is separate from the whole. This is the wisdom Alan Watts spent his life pointing toward. Liberation is not found in accumulating more love, more energy, more validation from others. It is found in recognizing what we already are beneath all the psychological construction and drama. When we rest in this recognition, energy stops draining because we are no longer engaged in the exhausting project of trying to be something other than what we are. May you find the courage to stop rescuing and the wisdom to start truly seeing. May you discover that your wholeness does not depend on fixing anyone, and your capacity to love is not measured by how much you sacrifice. May you remember that you are not here to drain or be drained, but to dance, sometimes together, sometimes apart, always exactly as you are meant to be in this eternal unfolding of consciousness experiencing itself. The universe is not broken. It does not need fixing, neither do you, neither does anyone else. What appears as brokenness is simply the temporary forgetting of our true nature. When we stop trying to fix this forgetting in others and instead rest in the remembering ourselves, we become genuinely helpful, not through doing but through being, not through rescuing but through radiant presence. This is the teaching hidden in your exhaustion. Stop trying so hard. Allow what is to be what it is. Trust the process of awakening in yourself and others. And most of all, remember that you are the universe experiencing itself as you, perfectly imperfect, temporarily confused, eternally whole.